My background is in science. I do have a doctorate in nuclear physics, but I'm also a Bible scholar. I've taught from the Bible through many different books, and the challenge to me as a believer always is, do science and the Bible complement each other, or is there a real conflict between them? And my view is that the Bible and science are complementary to each other, and we have the evidence for that. The more science finds out, the more we see that the Bible is true scientifically. And this talk I put together, it's called Evolution Showstopper, and I've challenged skeptics with this. I've put this out on my website a number of times already and challenged skeptics. I present 4 different arguments on why evolution can't even get started, which I'm going to discuss tonight. I said, show me where I'm wrong. Nobody has come back and showed me this. So show this to your friends who are unbelievers and challenge them to find a hole in my arguments. Or if they are believers, show them this, because this will encourage them in their faith. So the talk is called Evolution Showstopper. So let's jump into that. I'm going to go through a little bit of introduction. What is the biblical worldview of life? And then also look at what does evolution say about life. And you'll see that they conflict with each other quite significantly. I'm going to go through another few discussions on these topics of chance, necessity, and design. You might say, what's that all about? Well, I'll explain in a minute. The lecture I'm giving here, in terms of evolution, if we have evolution, Darwinian evolution, there must be a first cell for evolution to even get started. And of course, for that first cell to come, according to evolution, there's got to be a beginning to the universe. Those 3 steps, and I'll explain what I mean. So, but this lecture is going to be focused on the middle one there. What about the origin of first life by natural procedures? Is that even possible? And I'm going to look at 4 aspects of that. The law of biogenesis, the formation of components of life, the law of mathematical probability, and information, the source of information. So with that in mind, let me jump in here. The biblical view of life, I think you understand. You can understand right from the very first chapter of Genesis. In the first chapter of Genesis, God uses the word kinds 10 times. Everything was created according to its kind and reproduced according to its kind. So that's how we view life. And when you look at the fossil record carefully, you'll see that it does support that, and I'm sure Chris will show that in his talk on the 15th as well. So that's pretty simple. We have dog kinds, cat kinds, cow kinds, human kind, all those different kinds. And there's no mixing between them at all. They're all separate kinds. The fossil record shows that as well. What does evolution say? Well, 3 major points. First of all, we're all related through common ancestry. Every life that we see, plant or animal, started from one living cell. So the question is, where did that living cell come from? And then once you have that living cell, the cell duplicates, multiplies, and then differentiation comes through mutations and natural selection. That's according to the theory of evolution. And how's this done? Random chance processes of nature. And as atheists like Dawkins will want to say, is that evolution has no direction, no plan, nothing. It's just all random chance processes. So in that story, Darwin didn't address the origin of the first living cell, but in a later writing, he surmised that life could have started in some primordial soup in the early earth. If all the components were there in that primordial soup, they all got together, and voila, there's a first living cell. Could that happen? And so the rest of the story, evolution, if you have the first living cell, bacteria, more complex cells, primitive cells, fish, amphibians, mammals, birds, apes, and then us, humankind. That's the evolution story. That is not according to the Bible at all. So, how do evolutionists explain this? Well, they use a point of view of scientific materialism. And what is that? It's a belief claiming that physical matter is the only or fundamental reality, and that all organisms, processes, and phenomena can be explained as manifestations of interactions of matter. So everything can be explained in terms of matter and energy and time. And Einstein's theory equation, E equal mc squared. Energy and mass, they are conserved in total, but they can go from energy can go to mass can go to energy, but the total energy in the universe is constant. And they say everything can be explained in terms of the matter and energy and changes over time. But the other thing we have to realize is that we are familiar with the scientific method. We come up with a theory, we propose some tests that can be used to test the theory, experiments. We run the experiments, we get some results, and see if they match the theory. If they don't, we may modify it somewhat, and if we get something that seems to support the theory, we can ask a colleague to do the same thing, run the same experiment, and see if they get the same result. That's okay today, but what about in the past? You can't test things that happened in the past. You can't test creation. You can't test evolution. You've got to use a different method to come up to your conclusions. And normally, one way I like to describe it is using forensic science. And when we try to solve a crime, and the suspect, nobody observed the crime, and so how do we find the suspect? We look at evidence. And today, of course, we use DNA, and that's a very good way to identify potential suspects. And we can do the same thing with the world that we see today. We can look at fossils as believers. Evolutionists can look at fossils. We're looking at the same fossils. Fossils are not labeled according to time or, this is a transitional fossil or not. We have to look at the evidence and determine that. So how do we distinguish between science, history, and belief? This is one way to look at it. Science, you think of things that you can test in the present, you can observe them, you can test them, and it's repeatable. You can run repeat experiments and see what results you get. That's science. But if something happened in the past, and there were eyewitnesses, so there was somebody to record them, that's called history. But if it happened in the past, and there were no eyewitnesses, at least human eyewitnesses, then, and obviously it's not repeatable, then that's a belief system. And in that sense, creation and evolution are both belief systems. Evolution is too. Evolution is not good science, as we can see. Science does not back up evolution. The other concept I want to get across, excuse me, that everything can be explained in terms of these three concepts. Either it happened by chance, with random things happen, and it's just a chance event. Or there's a law of nature which causes that to happen. For example, if I put my foot over the podium here, which way am I going? Up or down? Always down, 100%. That's what we call a law of nature. It's fixed, and you'll always go down. However, if it can't be described by one of those two concepts, then it must be designed. There's intelligence behind what we see. And if you apply that to these faces on the mountain, you'll see the only credible explanation is these were designed and carved into the mountain. It didn't happen because of the way the rain fell on the mountain. that carved out these faces. There was an intelligent agent behind it and a design. So to put this first life into perspective, I just want to summarize the three major stages of evolution that we consider in science. The first is, and this is secular science, cosmic evolution. Many secular scientists believe that we got here through the Big Bang. So the Big Bang, a singularity exploded, and here we have the galaxies, the stars, and the planets, and all that came from there. And second, they would say at some point, first life started on Earth. And so, secular scientists would say that life started on Earth about 4.5 billion years ago or so. And so, what are the conditions necessary for that to happen? Is that even possible? And that's what we're going to address in this lecture. And then third stage is really what I call biological evolution or Darwinian evolution, where from the first cell, the cells start to differentiate, they duplicate, reproduce, and then start to differentiate, and that's how you get all the diverse life in the world. That's what evolution would say. So those three stages of evolution we can talk about. But in this case, I want to talk about the origin of first life. So I said there's 4 points I'm going to discuss that would show that first life cannot start by random chance processes. And I'll use these 4 arguments. First one is the law of biogenesis, which states that in nature, life comes only from life and that of its kind. That's what we define as the law of biogenesis. Thousands of years ago, Greek philosophers thought that life could generate spontaneously from non-living material. And that's how people thought until just a few hundred years ago. There was some discussion about, let's run an experiment to see if we can get life to start from non-living material. And these 4 scientists ran experiments, and the most significant one is the last one of 1864, Pasteur, but they concluded conclusively that you can't have life start from non-living material. It's impossible. And that's a law. That's still regarded as a law. So there are other hypotheses proposed over the last century, and we're going to look at some of those as well. But basically, the law of biogenesis has never been falsified. Here's some important milestones we might remember in this discussion. You'll remember that Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, and significantly there was a big argument between Darwin and other scientists of that day, including Pasteur, and he showed conclusively 5 years later that it's impossible to start life from non-living material. Abiogenesis is impossible. And then I'm sure you've heard of the Miller's experiment, where Miller ran an experiment where he tried to show that some of the components of life could start under certain conditions in the early Earth. And then in the same year, as a matter of fact, the discovery of the DNA double helix. And from this, and further science after that, we know that the DNA is where the information is in our living cells. Darwin had no idea about that before he came up with his theory. And then I'm sure you're familiar with the intelligent design movement. The Discovery Institute here in Seattle is a big prime mover of that movement. There is a creation scientist, Dr. Gett, who is an expert on information, and he's developed some laws of information which have been shown to be true and never been shown to be false. And significantly, in 2009, there was a meeting of 16 leading evolutionists. They know that the mechanism of mutations and natural selection doesn't work. There's no way it can work. So these people met in Austria to try and come up with a new way of explaining that. Excuse me. And they were, of course, unsuccessful in doing that. First of all, let me just remind you this: the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, they promoted spontaneous generation, and they had no access to information like microscopes or telescopes to tell much more. And so they just believed that, yes, life just started from non-life spontaneously. So that belief held sway for 2,000 or more years until Pasteur came along, 1864, and put that to rest. So that experiment shows that life just cannot start from non-living material. Nobody has ever shown that to be false, that law. So that should be the end of my talk. If you can't get the first living cell, you're not going to have evolution work. It's impossible. But let's go on. Well, first of all, Pasteur's experiment, I should show that too here. He had a protected environment where he kept out dust and particles, and without that in the jar, in a very protected jar, he showed the life just cannot start spontaneously. So there's more to say about that, but the conclusion is there is no way to start life from non-living components. So then the second point I want to go over is what components of life are we talking about? We know this today. Darwin had no idea what the components of life were in his day. So he just thought life was just, our bodies were made of blobs which somehow reproduced, but he had no way of determining what was in those blobs. He just thought, well, that's the way it works. Today, we know a lot more. And the major components of a living cell, which you see at the bottom here, it's very complex. The components such as the nucleus, chromosomes, proteins, RNA, DNA, that's all in that cell. Very complicated. And another important thing is there's a cell membrane. It's necessary to have a membrane for the interactions that happen in the cell to even work. These interactions can't happen outside of the membrane. So in an early Earth atmosphere, where would you get that membrane for these actions to happen? They can't. So these components are important for a living cell. And it turns out that the proteins, to create proteins, you need DNA. Well, where'd the DNA come from? Well, some scientists will say, well, there's an RNA. If RNA is simpler than DNA, first living materials start with RNA, and then eventually you got DNA. But again, it's a chicken and egg. You know what I mean? It just can't happen. So that's the high-level picture. You'll see in the top there, which is important when we come to the discussion, is that the proteins consist of amino acids. And in the Miller's experiment, he tried to show that it's possible to form amino acids. And what he hoped to show was, starting at the top, these the amino acids and nucleotides. The amino acids produce the proteins, and then he hoped to get some kind of a protocell, which then could explain how we got to the complex cell we have today. That's sort of what he was trying to show. So he thought, if I could show that the amino acids could be formed in an early Earth environment, then I've shown that we can start life on early Earth. Well, what did he produce? Notice that this is not a random occurrence. This is a designed experiment in the first place. There's intelligence involved in creating the experiment. So it's not happening out in this early Earth environment. It's a very protected environment. And the gases he chose turned out not to be correct. And the explosion with this electrode here produced some things like amino acids, but it produced more products like tars that were not part of life, obviously. So yes, it did produce some amino acids, but let's take a look at that. First of all, there are numerous problems with them, and I'll show you some of the major ones here. If there's oxygen in the early atmosphere, you can't even form amino acids. And he assumed there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. Well, if there's no oxygen, then the ultraviolet rays would destroy the amino acids. Amino acids can't form in an unprotected environment. And if they're formed in water, water decomposes bonds. And so the components couldn't start that way. What his experiment produced was some amino acids, but it produced the wrong amino acids. His experiment, first of all, produced 50% left-handed amino acids and 50% right-handed. Some of the left-handed amino acids were close to what's required for life, but life is comprised only of left-handed amino acids. So again, you produce something that couldn't survive. The low concentration of the products that were produced, there are many more contaminants, and we have to remember this didn't happen by chance. This was a designed experiment. So then scientists later tried to say, well, maybe we didn't find the right primordial soup where life could have started, perhaps in the bottom of the sea where there's hydrothermal vents at the right temperature that could possibly serve as the source of that, or volcano springs. But all of these other possible sources of where life could have started didn't pan out. It just doesn't work. So then some scientists said, well, maybe life started in space, or and maybe somehow that life got transmitted to Earth through some comet or some other mechanism. But if that didn't work, well, maybe somebody, intelligent being from outside, planted, beginning of living cells on the Earth, and that's how life started. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. That just moves the problem to a different place. And so that doesn't work. And here's some quotes, and I use these quotes just from scientists who are unbelievers. They believe in evolution. And here's what Yoki says. He's an atheist, and just reading the underlined parts, he says, a scenario describing the genesis of life on Earth by chance and natural causes which can be accepted on the basis of fact and not faith has not yet been written. So he admits, we don't have the answer. Another one here, Dr. Orgel, he said, I must admit that attempts to reconstruct this evolutionary process are extremely tentative. So again, they don't have the answer. This is very complicated, how to put all the components of life together. Darwin, of course, had no idea about the complexity of how to put all this together and how that would reproduce and differentiate. But today, science, we know that. So the third thing there's two strikes against it. The third one, if you look at the law of mathematical probability, can you form life from non-living components by chance? And you look at crazy examples like the second one here. What's the probability of creating a Boeing airplane which consists of 5 million non-flying parts in a huge junkyard with all the right components of the airplane? How you think there's any chance of that come together? No way. What about the forming a protein? just one simple protein. We have more than 100,000 different proteins, types of proteins in our body. Can we form even one protein by random chance? We ask that question. First of all, what is a protein? Well, it consists of amino acids in a very specific order. There are a few thousand types of amino acids, but remember they come in left-handed and right-handed. And life, the proteins, the building blocks of life, contain large organic molecules, contain hundreds to even thousands of amino acids in a very specific order. And the only amino acids they can use to form the proteins is 20 specific left-handed amino acids. So of all those thousands kinds of amino acids, only the 20 specific left-handed amino acids make up a protein. And if you get a working protein, and if you were to take one of those amino acids out or add another one, it just doesn't work. It's not a working protein. So it is very specific requirements. Let's look at the mathematical probability. I'm not going to take you through all the math here, but basically, if you consider a protein of 200 amino acids in a very specific order, and you look at the ways you can align them, it comes to a number like 10 to the power of 375. And if you were try to find, come up with different alignments, let's say a few billion per second, if that's what's possible to do, even if you assume that the universe is 13, 14 billion years old, there's still not enough time to form the right sequence and form a protein. Probability comes down to 1 in 10 to the 356. But there are only 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the whole universe. So, and mathematicians have determined that anything less than 1 in 10 to the power of 50 is impossible. Just can't happen. Impossible. So these numbers are so small that it's impossible even to form one living protein. How simple can life be? Well, we know today, and of course Darwin knew none of this. Look at a small bacteria. Take one number there, 580,000 DNA base pairs, letters, make up that bacteria. That's quite a few. The human genome has 3 billion of those DNA base pairs. The probability of forming the bacteria is 0. Mathematically 0. So if you can't even form that, you're certainly not going to get a complex human being out of that. And remember, this is all due to the complexity of the human cell. If you look at one there, we don't have to go over all the components, but you can just see. I mean, one of the important things is the membrane around all that, because all the interactions within the cell could not operate without a membrane. And so it's a very special environment. You've got the proteins, mitochondria, nucleus, chromosomes, you name it, all those parts in there. And we have 75 trillion of those in our body. So just think of the mathematical probability associated with that. And I'm sure you all remember how we determine probability, flipping a coin and coming up heads. You have half a 50% chance of coming up heads every time you flip it. And you can do the multiplication, trying to get just 10 heads in a row. For example, it's a chance of 1 in 1,000. You got to try 1,000 times. If you want to go as far as 10,000 or 1,000 heads in a row, you get a number like 10 to the 300. Well, that just can't happen. Mathematically, anything less than 1 in 10 to the 50th just is not going to happen. So if you apply that to life, and let's take an example of a protein that has just 400 amino acids. The probability of getting that by random chance process is 1 in 10 to the power of 240. A single cell that you see at the bottom right there, What's the chance of all the parts of that cell coming together by random chance processes? Well, it's just, oops, sorry. That's just not going to happen. Because again, that number of atoms in the universe, 10 to the power of 80, and that is, this number 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. Law of probability says anything less than 1 in 10 to the 50 just cannot happen. So you can see the complexity of that cell by random chance processes is just not going to come together. Here's a quote from a mathematician in the UK. He's not a believer, but he came up with a mathematical calculation and came up with that number 40,000 knots. The probability is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. It's just not going to happen. And he admits they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. There's just no way that a first living cell can happen by random chance processes. Impossible. So then we come to the fourth reason why this just can't work, and that is life requires information. There's information in life. The only difference between non-living material and living material is information, and I'll explain what I mean. Remember that the evolutionists, they assume that everything can be explained in terms of mass and energy, two material things. But there's another non-material entity that we need to consider, and that's information. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go through this. So life consists, I would submit that life consists of mass and energy, which is material, and information, which is non-material. It has no weight, but it uses storage to store the information. Information in life is encoded in the DNA of our living cells. Information, if I look at the definition, has 4 different parts: code, meaning, action, and purpose. What do we mean by that? First of all, there's code. If you think of the English language, there's an alphabet, 26 letters. There's meaning. You can put those letters together into a word, which have meanings. And then there's you can put that together into a sentence, which is an action, and that the sentence has a purpose. Those 4 things define information. And if you think of sending information from a sender to a recipient here, the only way that the recipient can understand this is if he speaks the same language. In our case, English, German, whatever. Otherwise, it's useful information. So information is an encoded, symbolically represented message conveying expected action and intended purpose. Those 4 things. So let me go through that and explain it with some diagrams here. What is the nature of information? I talked about the alphabet, and we use the letters to form words. If I spill an inkwell, you'll understand that's not information as meaningless, it's just a blob. But if I use a pen, I can put those letters together into words and sentences like here, and if you can still read script, you can understand that. But if you're just using a typewriter, well, you can certainly read what's on the sand here. There's a 3 words, write in sand. And so we ask the question, did that happen by chance? Was there a law of nature which caused that to happen? Or was there intelligence behind it? Some intelligent agent, a human being, wrote that. And here's a more specific example. Information requires code, letters, numbers, meaning in words, and a sentence with a verb in it. That is the action of the sentence. and then we can surmise the purpose for the sentence from the design there. If I put together words like this, NEOJCT, I don't think you'll recognize as any language that anybody knows. So those are still, it's complex, but it's not specified. In order to be meaningful, the letters have to be specific and in a particular order. So here is an example of specified complexity. I read this sentence comprised of words and a verb that has meaning and that has a purpose. And that's what we mean by information. How does that apply to computers? Well, for computer geeks, of course, they know that information is stored as zeros and ones. It's all zeros and ones. And of course, you can look at that, a map of that, but it's meaningless unless you have some way of interpreting that. And computer programmers have languages that they use to create those bits, zeros and ones, so they can understand it. But the other thing I want to point out is that these zeros and ones, they are information, they have no weight. For example, the information in a computer is stored on a disk. If I take all the bits on that disk and zero them out, they're all zero, not random zeros and ones. You think the weight of the disk changes any? No. Whether it's a 0 or 1, doesn't matter. There's no weight change. And this information requires a programmer to produce the information. So there's an intelligent agent behind it. That's our experience. So if you look at the cell, you see that the double helix here with the base pairs in there, that is the information in our cells. And those base pairs are in this cell here. You can print, if you decide to print out what's in there, you could do that. It would take thousands of books to describe just one cell. And I'm not going to explain what all these letters mean, but it is information that geneticists understand. And the DNA is the molecule of life. And our cells, we have the human genome has 46 human chromosomes, 3 billion base pairs up here, and approximately 30,000 genes. That's all in our genome. You think that came about by chance? Not a chance. So what about machines? If you look at these machines, the assembly line, the motors, and another gear system here, integrated circuit, no question, they're all designed. There's an intelligent agent behind that. They didn't happen by chance. We know that. So then what about molecular? We have molecular motors in our bodies, in our cells. You can't feel them running, of course, which is a good thing. But if you look at this here, example, this molecular motor, you'll see gears here which look very much like gears in a motor that we're used to seeing. And the important thing to recognize, here we come up with a few concepts. The concept of irreducibly complex, what does that mean? That means all the parts need to be there to be functional. The simple example that Dr. Behe gives is the mousetrap, 5 parts. How many mice do you think you would catch if you took one of those parts away? None. They all have to be there. Same thing with our cells. All the parts have to be there to function. And so, yes, we have motors in our body. Okay, then we talk about programs. Well, if you're a computer geek, you know about hardware, system software, and application software. I'm running PowerPoint on my computer here, and that runs on top of the system software, Windows, and the hardware. And what's in there? Well, there are programs. You can see an example on the right-hand side here. You can't read it from where you sit, but that's a Java program. And can be compiled into those ones and zeros that you see in the computer. That's a program. What about the cell? Well, in the cell, we also have a program, which, remember I talked about the DNA and the RNA and the proteins. The DNA and RNA are involved in producing the proteins, but the DNA requires proteins to work. So there's that chicken and egg. And even people like Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, he knows and he recognized that the human genome is like a computer program, but far, far more complex, orders of magnitude more complex. You know how complex the Windows operating system is here. This is much more complex. You know that the Windows operating system didn't happen by chance. There are thousands of programmers who produced that. The cell did not happen by chance. And people recognize that. So let me move to the next one here. Life requires information, complexity, and design. The information in the living cell is that DNA, and we talked about the left-handed amino acids. Biological systems must have specified complexity, and what I mean by that, the amino acids in a protein must be in a very specific order to work. And it must be irreducibly complex, and now there's all the parts need to be there, or else it won't work. So what's the best explanation for this? It's design, intelligent design. There's an intelligent agent behind that. It just doesn't happen by chance. So if we look at life, the evidence for design, we see it in biology. We see it in the cell, in our genomes. We see that information. But you have atheists, evolutionists, who won't recognize that. Richard Lewontin, here's what he says: urges scientists to embrace a materialism that is absolute and to stick with the material explanations no matter how counterintuitive. They just won't recognize that. Here's two more quotes about living matter and information. Paul Davies, who is an evolutionist, he says, "Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell." He recognized that. Nobody knows. Werner Gitt, who I referred to before, a German information scientist, and also believes in creation, he said there's no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate itself in matter. So in summary then, life requires information. I said life is mass and energy, which is material. We can put our hands on that. And then there's information, which is non-material. We can't put our hands on that. So life requires the information stored in the DNA, machines for storage and programming of the DNA, the programs in there for replication, the irreducible complexity, in other words, all parts need to be there, specified complexity to give it meaning, and all that requires an intelligent mind. There's no way that you can form that information by a random chance process. It just doesn't work. So life from non-life, not by chance. Information is the basis for life, and information requires an intelligent mind. So we know all that. Atheists know that. Evolutionists know that. Here's a recent quote from Harvard atheist, George Whiteside. He talks on the origin of life, that this problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life and us in the universe. Most chemists believe, as I do, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic earth. That's what they believe. How did that happen? They have no idea. It's a belief. It's not based on science. And here's another example. Remember that I said everything can be explained in terms of chance, necessity, or law of nature, or design. You look at these scratches on the wall here. The one on the left is questionable, but if you look down below here, you'll see horse heads, cow heads, pig heads drawn on cave walls. Did that happen by chance? Was that some law of nature that required that to happen? Or did somebody carve that on there? I think you'll agree somebody carved it. There's intelligence involved there. So then if you look at the human genome and the human cell, can't you see those are designed? They're much, much more complicated than you see in the scratches on the cave wall. Aren't they designed? Well, let's see what the evolution says. 3 of them here. Professor Todd, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. And Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, biology is a study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. They have the appearance, but you won't admit that they were designed. Even Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. They just can't admit. The facts are there, and the conclusions are rather obvious. So, in conclusion then, life by random chance processes. Is that possible? Totally impossible. Well, I give you 4 reasons. You can read them here. I won't go over them in detail. If you have friends who don't believe in creation, they believe in evolution, show them this and ask them how that can possibly work. It doesn't work. It can't work for these 4 reasons. Information is the key to that. You could say the law of biogenesis, well, 1864, we should have known. Why go any further? Life can't start from non-life. Pasteur knew that. Darwin knew that, but he just came up with that his theory regardless. So, based on this, I would submit evolution can't even get started. And I'm talking about Darwinian evolution now. First of all, first life, you can't get that. It's impossible to get that by chance. It requires an intelligent agent. And I hope I've presented the facts in support of that. And I guess it would take time for some questions if people have questions.
For a few questions, so if you have any, raise your hand. Let me bring the mic around to you. 1 question at a time, please, and then let me get the mic back to you if you have a second question.
Yes, just recently, we had in the headlines that they have discovered a black hole in some faraway galaxy somewhere. So now we've heard many claims by scientists in the past with their theories and everything. What is the significance of this story of a black hole, anyways, in relation to creation and things like that?
Yeah, I know the stories you allude to there, and by the way, have nothing to do with first life, but you have to have the universe in order to get first life, so that's before that. And yes, they have images of what they think are black holes. I mean, remember, they can't see them. You can't see the black holes. They have to measure the effect of the black holes on the surrounding galaxy to come up with those pictures. And I've read some commentaries on creation websites like ICR and AIG, and they're still going through digesting that. And so I think we're going to keep on finding new things in science, and there are some things that are very hard to explain.
Any other questions? All right. Dr. Lycklama, was that a hand?
Yes, recently Stephen Hawking's died.
I'm sorry?
Isn't that
Stephen
Stephen Hawking's?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was looking for that particle in atomic matter that, anyway, it's a sad commentary, but he still believed in that particle that would show life. And are you familiar with that or comment on it?
I didn't catch the question again.
Yes, the God particle.
So he was looking for a particle that they called the God particle, and
yeah, the Higgs particle.
The Higgs
Yeah,
boson.
that was found, supposedly found a number of years ago now. Peter Higgs, who's a theoretical physicist from the UK, he surmised that there's a missing particle in the standard model of particles, and he surmised there must be a Higgs particle to explain that. And with high energy physics in the CERN experiments, they think they found that particle, but they called it. Some people called it a God particle, but that's a misnomer. It serves a purpose, but it has nothing to do with the origin of the universe, for example. Yeah, as some of these particles that scientists find, they are created by high energy collisions, and they have a very short half-life. I mean, they disappear in fractions of a second. You don't see them in our, in day-to-day life here. They can only be seen with high energy bombardments.
Okay, one more.
I heard one guy say recently that the kind of experiments they're doing with these accelerators, they're smashing.
I'm sorry?
The kind of experiments they're doing with these particle accelerators, that like CERN, are very chancy. I mean, they don't know exactly what they're going to create. They could create a bomb or something because they're discovering new elements and new relationships, and it's risky at some point.
Well, some people have expressed fear that what they might find might blow up the whole accelerator. That they don't know. That's true, but so far it hasn't produced that.
Any other questions? All right. So we do have an offering plate in the back. If you can help us with the monies that we take up here dedicated for this specific program and to pay our future speaker honorariums. So make out checks to Cedar Park Church. All the money goes to them. Next week I'm going to be doing a talk on animal design. So very cool, very kid-friendly as well. Just pointing out a lot of newly discovered amazing design features that have been found in animals, as well as technologies that have been developed after studying much of God's creation, what we call biomimicry. So amazing animal designs. My talk for next week. Who do you have coming up at the Apologetics Forum this month? Coming up, who's your speaker? Upcoming speaker?
Yeah, we have a fellow by the name of Kyle Justice. He's from Portland, and he's a producer of creation films.
Right.
And in fact, they just came out with a new video, Kyle and Pat Roy, debunking flat Earth. People that believe in a flat Earth.
Oh, talking about the flat Earth claims
Right.
and stuff. Oh, wow.
Apparently, it's a big topic, and they've come up with that. He's going to be speaking at our forum on the 17th on the topic of the heavens declare, and he'll talk about issues to do with the origin of the universe. Some of the questions you asked, for example. He's interviewed 5 different experts, astronomers, cosmologists, and put together a video.
I think his ministry is Awesome Science Media.
Yeah,
Is that
Awesome Science.
They're the ones that did. They did a series with his son that was narrated by his son Noah Justice. Yeah, where
Yeah.
done a lot. He's done a lot of work. So he's speaking on the 17th.
17th.
17th,
Yeah.
and
Of May.
at like 7 p.m. Atonement Free Lutheran Church.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, something to see. Kyle Justice. All right. I think that's it. Again, there's still coffee in the back. Grab yourself a cup on the way out. Dr. Lycklama, would you close us out in a word of prayer?
Yeah, and just to remind you, some of you were trying to take notes, all of my presentations are on my website. So if you look at that and just do a search for, Evolution Showstopper, you'll find them.
And would you mind, what is the website address of the Apologetics Forum of Snohomish County?
Yeah,
It's-
apologeticsforum.org, but my website, you could also, you can find it on there.
Okay, very good.
So all my lectures are on the website. Father, we come to you just to thank you for this time together. We thank you for the evidence that you have given, Lord, that supports your word. And we see here in the beginning of first life, what you tell us in the first chapter of Genesis is true. And we see evidence for that in the fossil record. And we see evidence that with evolution's project and is just conjecture. It's philosophy, and it's not science. And we just thank you for helping us to make that clear. And we just pray that the word would go forth in that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.